stadium in England. I did ask before I spoke there if girls had ever played in the stadium, and you know they had, and they'd had 10,000 people come and watch the All England girls rugby team play in the stadium. It's at 87,000, so you know, we're technologically okay. I have a lot of gizmos here. I have one here, and then I have this clicker thing, so I'm going to try and make it all work. I'm honored to be here. I just had my 65th birthday. And next month the government's going to start sending me money. And I'm quite excited about it. But my memory's going, and I'm a lot grumpier than I used to be, so I hope that I can not disappoint you today. Let's slide it. Oh, wait a minute. That must be
upside down.
It just blows a horn. Oh, it's the wrong one. Wait a minute, that's not the right thing. Oh, there. Okay. I press that thing that blows the horn on my truck all the time, too, you know? So I've called my talk Mind the Gap and Mind the Reward. I've had a lot of opportunity to work for change, but almost entirely at the national level. And now that in my old age, I just want to stay home. And Nova Scotia is my home. I've been here for 26 years now. My family is here. My grandson was born here. And my next grandchild will be born here. This is my retirement present, by the way, the second one. So it's a spectacular place to live. I know you'll agree. And I'm really proud that all of us are here on a Saturday morning to address this issue that's so important to me, and I know to you. I've called my talk, as I said, Mind the Gap, Mind the Rewards. I know that I don't have to spend time convincing you of the importance of engaging in sport and recreation and physical activity. You've seen what's in your kit, you've seen the wonderful video, you heard the remarks from our minister, and of course, we work in the area. It's our lives. We know how important it is. Everybody's quickly concluding that there isn't a better predictor of wellness than participation in sport and physical activity, and certainly there's no better contributor to physical health, and it's beginning to look like mental health, than engaging in physical activity. The importance of what we're talking about is incredibly obvious to all of us. I suspect you're pretty familiar with the data as well. And some of it's in your kit, and we saw some of it on the screen in the video, and we use it virtually every day. So we've counted the active and the inactive so many times that now we have our physiologists turning to counting people who are sedentary. That's us, you know, there's a count of another hour sitting down today. We've got some great strategies at the national level, at the provincial level, and many of you wonderful strategies at the municipal level. And they are making a difference to those counts, regardless of how we made them. But we're not closing the gap that I'm referring to. It looks to me like this kind of gap that we see in the scenery. It's there, it appears the same size throughout our lifetime, and there's nothing to change it. So this gap between men and women, boys and girls, has been shown to exist so many times that I think we've come to accept it as normal. We report it, indeed we do, more men than women. More boys than girls are physically active. We take it as a given. 7% of Canadian children achieve 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day, 6 days a week, the Canadian Health Survey recently told us. And if we look at 3 days a week, we can say that 44% of Canadian children are engaging in moderate physical activity for 60 minutes a week. But you know, when we go away and into the raw data as it was collected, here instead is what we see. Our 44% becomes 33% for girls and 53% for boys. And when we look at the 6-day data, for which 7% is the figure we like to use, in fact, it's 4% for girls and 9% for boys. That 43% for 3 days, 10%. Where we're going to go is to 43% for girls and to 63% for boys. And that gap is going to be there when I die and when my grandson is old. If we don't begin to specifically address that particular gap. So if I go to one of the early studies, and you know, we've changed the way we count many, many times now, but if we look at the studies that are comparable, 2000, 47% of men active enough to receive health benefits. That's the old talk, you know, but 7 years later, we're still using it, so I can compare, and we see that we managed to make a 4% difference. These are from the CFLRI, the national data, by the way. 41% of women in 2000, 45% of women in 2007. What have we got? A 6% difference in 2000? Son of a gun. A 6% difference in 2007. Did we do good work? Indeed we did. More people are active. Have we touched that gap? Not even a little bit. There it sits. That's the way life is, perhaps. Maybe the gap is just the way it is. It looks to be. But perhaps if we paid some close attention to it, we could in fact close that gap. We have different ways of measuring activity levels than we did in 2000, but it doesn't matter the methodology. We see the gap. 15% of Canadian adults accumulate 150 minutes of MVPA, we call it these days, moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, but men are more active than women. When we count steps, men accumulate 9,500 steps per day, women 8,400, and so on. And in the latest report that I looked at, I'm not sure which one, it was around the time the physical activity report period was released, there was actually a picture of what we're going to look like when we add 2,000 steps to the repertoire of Canadian adults. And there's the picture. And of course it still looks like this. The gap's still there. Without comment on it, and that seems to be acceptable. We accept the gap as long as we move everybody a little bit. The gap can stay. What about sport? Well, here some of the numbers for sport have been mentioned already, but here's a count done in 2009 in Canada, and we see that 36% of men are blue on this slide are sport participants and 64% non-participants. Of course we want to change that. We want far more of them. But look at the dilemma we have here. 18% of women sport participants and 82% non-participants. So many times I've seen these data reported in the first paragraph, averaged in the second paragraph, and off we go, as if the entire significance of the sex of the participant has been taken care of. Then we design a strategy to address this generic, ungendered participant. So the gap, of course, stays. And then there are our children, and with kids we've been looking at organized sport and informal sport. And you see, regardless, 36% of boys in organized sport, 59% in informal, and our girls 22 and 46. So there's the gap, even when we go out to play on the playground. Whether we count, as Maureen mentioned, whether we're counting kids or adults as participants, coaches, officials, administrators, board members, always the gap. Fewer women participate. There's tons of data, and I'm not going to show you a lot of it, but we have really solid data, and it matters to have that to proceed. But here's a very complete study that was done in 2009 of coaching of high-performance athletes. So 819 coaches responded, representing 56 sports. 94 employers responded, people who employed these coaches. So 35 national sports organizations, 35 universities, and 24 colleges. And from all that mass of coaches, 26% are female. And this despite some real efforts to bring women into coaching. We're beginning to learn how to solve the problem, but we have so much work to do. If we go at a high level, in the Olympic data, I think now the highest we've been is 10%. Is it, Karen? Around?
Winter maybe was 14 or 15.
Okay, there you go. Good news. So 10 to 15% of coaches. So I often have young women who come to me and they want to be coaches, and I wonder, I encourage them and support them, and I wonder really what the possibilities are for them. Of course, we recognize that other factors besides sex impact participation in sport and physical activity. But here's another eye-opener. This gender gap that we're talking about applies in every case. So if we examine low-income Canadians, fewer low-income women than low-income men participate. If we examine Canadians with disabilities, fewer women than men participate. If we examine racial minorities, if we look at our First Nations people, fewer women than men participate. When we proactively promote participation by these populations, which we're trying hard to do, if we don't pay any attention to that gap, it stays. We never change the gap. The only way we're ever going to change the gap is to focus on the gap. And that's why we've asked you to come here, because we have to take action in a very specific way, in a very specific problem, to address a very specific issue. Can we close this gap? Can we get more girls and women to engage in physical activity and sport? Well, oh my goodness. So Andy Warhol, you know, tries to play a role in most things. And this is my favorite Andy Warhol quote. They always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself. So I haven't seen a predictor in sport and recreation, but I have seen one some years ago about university faculty, where I think nationally now, somewhere around 30% of professors women, which is, looks pretty good to some of us looking at some of these numbers in our field. But the article said that it was predicted that if we let time take care of it, in 300 years, things would sort themselves out. So when I started in this business, my daughter, who was on the organizing committee for this event, had just arrived in my life. And I thought, I gotta get this fixed. This child is gonna grow up in a different world than the one we know. I'll have this fixed before she starts sport at 4 years old. So now I see my grandson and I think, his mother will have this fixed. But if we leave it to time, my grandchild's great-grandchildren will not see it fixed. So we have to change it ourselves. So I want to turn my attention to this taking action. And have a little chat with you about that. That's not the next slide, So, where are we going to start? Tough problems can't be addressed, and this is a really tough problem, unless we talk about the nature of the problem. And sometimes this gap we measure is not easy to talk about. And I think that's a good part of the reason that we haven't really addressed it as much as we'd like. So the gap leaves us with feelings and messages that we don't like. And some of the reasons the gap exists are uncomfortable reasons for us to talk about. So we heard Rhonda tell us about her daughter's experience with high school sport in the video, when male and female athletes in high school on game day were treated quite differently. I know many of you have had similar kinds of experiences. These aren't examples of blatant discrimination. They're just people doing what comes naturally to them, which is what they did last year. And there's no harm intended, but quite likely there is harm done. I wonder, I've got a couple of wandering mics out in my audience. Hey, where are they? Yeah. I'm wondering if some of you might have stories that you could share with us about an experience similar to the one Rhonda told us about in the film. Just so, just things that sort of you went, oh well, that's life. Or that's the way it is. Can anybody think of something? Here we go.
I'm Anna Stamberger, Dalhousie women's basketball coach. I found it was a situation I had taken over from basketball guru here, Dr. Carolyn Savoy, and it was one of our first away games, and actually I think it was at UNB, and of course there was no question when they brought the game sheet to the Dalhousie bench, who they brought the game sheet to check off the starters. For 32 years it was Dr. Savoy, so there was no question of who do I give this to. When we were on the bench, my two female assistant coaches and myself, and there was one male on our entire bench, and he was at that time the sports psychologist or mental trainer that Dr. Savoy had working with the team and working with her, and very nice gentleman, and he was standing there, and we were all standing there together, 3 females and this mental skills trainer, and the lady from the scores table came and brought the game sheet to him and gave him the game sheet, and didn't even inquire who is the head coach. And I didn't expect her to know who the head coach would have been, because the game hadn't started yet. Usually the head coach stands, but we were all standing there. But she just brought it to him, and what I also didn't appreciate is that he then started to check off the starters. So that was a problem that I then addressed. But there were two problems there. One was that she automatically assumed that that the male was the head coach. So that sort of annoyed me. And then the next one was that he assumed that he should overtake that responsibility of checking off the starters. So anyway, needless to say, he didn't work with our team too many seasons after that. Anyway, that was my experience.
I mean, these are playing the odds, hey? There's a 1 in 4 chance that you're the coach. So that's what the score was doing. Go ahead, who's got it? Yeah.
I'm Shannon Reed from the town of Oakville, activity coordinator. One of my daughters, I have 3, all very involved in sports, and one played soccer at St. Mary's University, and in her 5th year, she was the first Canadian soccer player to get a CIS Community Service Award. So they flew her to Victoria, gave her a box of chocolates, and gave her her award, and she got back to Halifax, and her good buddy Eric Lavick said, "So how much money did you get?" She said, "Money? Let's get money." And she's quite taken aback by that. And her response actually was, I looked into it and found out the whole history behind the male athletes getting, financial awards. But her response is that she's going to make enough money to actually create a $5,000 award, which would be $2,000 more than the male's award.
Anybody else? Here we go. Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, I'm Carol. I work with the Department of Health and Wellness. But in my early days of my career, I was a recreation director in a small municipality in Nova Scotia. And my colleague was in the town in this municipality. She was also female. And so there was interest in a new facility being created. So a planning team was developed that was all male. But we were the 2 recreation directors that were at the table. And we discovered very early that as much as we would offer suggestions, the guys weren't listening. So we learned, okay, you get a guy and I'll get a guy, give them the idea, and watch them make the exact same statement, and it was accepted. And it was frustrating as hell for us at that time, but it required us to be strategic in how we actually move things forward. We realized we weren't going to, our voices weren't being heard. And so we had to do a lot of our work that way in these 2 small municipalities.
My name's Gerard. I work with Health and Wellness as well. So back in the day when I was a soccer coach and my girls' new soccer team, being somewhat frustrated that the solution given up by the local soccer association in terms of equipment for the team would be that they would get the boys' old jerseys and the boys then would get the new jerseys. So again, unintended injury, but they wouldn't lose there.
I'm Leslie. I'm from La Crosse, Nova Scotia. I'm on the board of directors as Vice President of Marketing and Promotion. I think one of the things within our sport that's probably not uncommon in any leadership role is the ability to transition women into leadership positions within a provincial governing body. I've been very blessed. I chair the nominating committee for the past 2 consecutive years, so we have gone from minimal female representation on our board to being able to have a quarter of our board now as women, so we're moving forward. What we don't have, despite several attempts, is at the national level we are completely blocked from having female representation on executive leadership, and that's sad. Very sad. It's hard when I go out and I speak to clubs and associations to show our female players, our female coaches and officials that there is a path to leadership within our sport. Yeah, the only path that I can show them right now is the path to provincial leadership. I cannot show them that there is a clear path for them to get to national leadership in the sport.
Other than being the former Dow basketball coach, I was also on the Dalhousie Faculty Association, so this is a story about that. And in 1988, they asked me to be on the negotiating team. So we put together some of our demands of what we thought we would want. And one of them was comparability, to pay women the same amount of money as men for doing the same work at the university. And the Faculty Association was in support of it, and so we brought it forward. Well, we didn't get that demand, and we ended up going on strike. That was the major demand why everybody went on strike in 1988. And they finally did give into it. My personal salary, I worked from 77 to 88 there at that point. My personal salary was increased $3,100. That's how much less I had been paid than a man at that time. I mean, so it didn't even take, the past. But what we felt really good about it is that we would pay it forward so that now when women are hired, that they would receive equal pay for the same work that a male would do.
One more? Actually, I thought I'd follow up on that one, on the pay, because I have a small experience in coaching at the university level for 3 years, and I was hired to coach women's volleyball, women's soccer. And my pay was not great. I guess it was $29,000 at the time, that was 93. But I thought, and I was teaching in the phys ed department as well, and doing some work with education students when they went out into the field. And so I started to dig around about funding, and I found out a lot of things. But I did find out that I was, as head coach of 2 teams, I was making the same salary as the assistant football coach who was working on his undergrad degree. So that was the beginning. And then I dug a little further. I have to tell you this one too, because I like to tell the story. I also found out that there was quite a huge fund to entice student athletes to come to play at the school, and I don't know, something like $70,000 or $80,000, and it was distributed through all the teams. And the football team probably got around $25,000, and the men's hockey, because there was only men's hockey then, got about 15 or 20, and men's basketball around 15, and then worked our way down and got to the women's soccer and women's volleyball, and we got 500 per team. So and a lot has changed since then.
Hi there, my name is Joanna Gonzalez Miners. I work for the provincial body of the Status of Women office, and part of what we do is we hear concerns and issues from the community regarding the status of women. And we received a call just recently about it's surrounding Taekwondo, and part of the traditional martial arts is before you do your sparring, you bow with your opponent. And it was between a young woman and a young man. And this young man said, "I'm not bowing to a woman because it's part of my religion. I can't do it, forget it." And so the young teenager woman was upset, and so was the mother was very upset. So she called us, and we received the call. And then we're left with this conundrum, the limits of accommodation versus, that's part of Taekwondo martial arts, is you bow towards your opponent. And so, just something to ponder, and just the rules of the game and limits of accommodation. So.
Last word.
Hi. Sorry, Farida Gavan speaking. One of my daughters, when she was in grade 11, she was in a physical education program. She came home and said, "We didn't have phys ed today." And I asked her why. And she said that the phys ed teacher, who was a male, had sent the girls to the locker room to spend the time there because the boys' wrestling coach was coming to work with the boys that day. And so anyway, she saw the smoke coming out of my ears, and I asked her if she minded if I, dealt with it, or did she feel that she was going to suffer for that because I had done that. She said, no, I'd like you to deal with it, because she said the thing that really upset me, and I was so proud of her when she said this, was that the rest of the girls thought it was okay. You know, they didn't have to participate that day, and they could just sit and chat in the locker room. So I actually called the teacher, and he said that he'd had permission from the head of department to do that. And so I said, well, you know, this is curriculum. How come my daughter missed her class? And you know, anyway, you can imagine what I said. And he accused me. He said, "Are you accusing me of being sexist?" And I said, "Yeah." So anyway, I called the head of department and followed up on that, and he did apologize in the end. But it was my daughter who touched me the most, in that she was really concerned about the other girls thinking that that was an okay thing.
Thank you all very much. I know there are many other stories, you know, and each story, I think, helps us understand the complexity of the issue. So, you know, it doesn't make sense then, I'm sure, to us when we say we have fewer women coaches, but, you know, here's a course and they're welcome to come. And then we hear stories about what happens to our keen young coaches, what happens to girls and women in sport and recreation. And we think, you know, there's more to this than opening the door. There's a whole lot more. When we get to issues as complex as people's belief systems and the clashes, and we know of several between religion and the rules of sport, then indeed these issues are very, very tough to address. But, you know, Farida's comment about the other girls just seem to accept it is an important one as well, because we're so used to these things. We do. They are a given to us, and some that we think we've solved years ago crop up again. We just handed out $50,000 to achieve pay equity in our lower ranks last month. So even though we started doing this in the 80s, now we find that women's qualifications are under-assessed when they're hired. In fact, their salary is set too low, and that's a problem. So there's tons of things around us. It's, and I want us to think for a minute about these young girls in junior high and high school and what's happening to them. You know, it's one thing to tell your mom, as Farida's daughter and Rhonda's daughter managed to do. It's another whole thing to actually tell your peers and tell your school. So when we say things like sport improves self-esteem, I guess our analysis of those kinds of situations would be that it doesn't quite improve the self-esteem of girls as much as it does of boys, because part of our message to them is girls' sport isn't as important. Another gap, you see. Everywhere I look, I see the gap. So I want us to think about the messages that get sent to these young girls, and what a tough place we put them in. And I wonder, after all these years, if the reward for a young girl in dating an athlete is not larger than the reward for being on the school team, for being an athlete. And are the questions and pressures about young girls' sexuality still there? You know, if sport is male, at least the important part of sport is male, then a young boy can prove that he's manly by entering sport. But what happens to a young girl who enters sport? What's the proof that's emerging there? And what are her 12 and 11 and 13-year-old peers? What's the conversation there? What's the dynamic? When we look at those sport numbers, you know, until around 9 or 10, they're pretty good. Around the third grade, right? You got till the third grade. We're good till then. And then we start to see that separation. Well, what happens? And I think some of these things are still there. And these are the tough things to talk about that I've been mentioning to you. You would have seen Alyssa, our medical student and a provincial rugby player in the video, talk about this questioning of the sexuality of female coaches. And then we have just talked about the questioning of the sexuality, the sexual orientation of young girls. And we need to be able to talk about and understand those pressures and find a way to address them intelligently. Some of our schools are terrific in addressing lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues. I don't think sport has been a player in that conversation. And that's a tough place for us to get a conversation going. But we need to. Karen's organization, Cause, has some terrific materials for us in this regard. A wonderful publication about homophobia and a great workshop. Karen, you're still offering the workshop. I don't know how many sport organizations have taken advantage of skilled workshop presenters to have a real good chat about that issue, but the resources are there. So I wanted to start our discussion with a tough issue, because if we want to get to closing the gap, we've got to be able to go there, and making change is tough. This is not for the faint of heart. I'll share some of my scars with you shortly, and I know that some of you, I detected some scars in the speaking just now. Before that, I want to take a minute to think about some other fun things. Women's sport over time. I want to dispel the myth that women aren't as active in sport because they got elite stars. This is not elite stars, right? So this is Ada McKenzie, a brilliant golfer who won, I think, 4 huge championships by 1908 when this picture was done. These are Acadia teams, the teams from my university, the basketball team from 1912 and the hockey team from 1914. We don't have a varsity hockey team today, but we did in 1914. So it's hard to blame stuff on the past. Say, well, we've never had a women's hockey team. Oh, yes, we did. So, and this is a wonderful picture. Some of you might recognize this. I know you can't see it very clearly. This is a group of women known as the Matchless Six, who women's track and field was part of the Olympic Games in 28, and Canada sent these 6 brilliant women who won more medals for Canada than any track and field team has done since. There are some very famous names amongst these 6 people. So, in fact, in Canada, sport historians regard the 20s and 30s as the golden age of women in sport. Here's another favorite of mine. This is Gertrude Finney, a good Wolfville girl. And you'll see that women weren't allowed to be on the track team at Acadia. Sometimes we miss the boat in universities, because Gertrude became ran world-class times when she did participate. She should have been at the Olympic Games, but her dad didn't approve of women competing in sport. And he didn't forbid her to go, the story goes, but she wasn't comfortable with making her dad uncomfortable. The ethic of care that women have. I need to take care of my dad, I'll just pass on the Olympics. But here is, a brilliant athlete from our Nova Scotia past. So women's sport history is actually a very rich history. We just don't know about it. And I think it's another part of why we have a gap, because every generation of girls in sport think they're pioneers. I see my students in the classroom in front of me now, and they have this idea that they're pioneer performers, and things will get better. My couple of wonderful young athletes who play on a club hockey team at Acadia told me just last year in my class that when their team gets good enough, they'll be a varsity team. See, they think they're a new generation and they're gonna get good enough and then the reward will come. And that's what we've all thought. Our grandmothers thought, our mothers thought, our kids think, hey, we're the pioneers. Look at girls and women's sport. It's great. We're out here now. It can only get better. But you know, it's 100 years, gang. Hey? So girls don't know that their grandmothers and great-grandmothers and mothers played too. We didn't celebrate it then. And although we're better at it, we still don't celebrate it enough. The gap is a big one. And it's bigger now than it was in the 30s and 40s in that golden age. So my students tell me that they get all their news from television and all their sport news from Sports Center. Okay? We don't have the Canadian data, but Brenda can tell you the number of nights she experiences blind fury at the sports center. So we don't really need to count it. But, you know, here are the network news, sports news, you know, when they put in the sports piece on the news, for NBC, CBS, and ABC, from 1989 to 2009, over 20 years. And this is the percentage of the news over a 6-week period. The newscasts were monitored, and from 3 networks. And men's sport in the final year received 96.3% of the airtime over that 6 weeks. Women's sport is at the top, that's the 1.6%, and the bar at the bottom is a gender-neutral topic, around 2.1%. So this is what we're bombarded with, in being convinced, indeed, that men's sport matters more than women's, and hence the gap is perfectly natural and normal, and how would you expect anything else? This is my favorite new hobby, ticker time. So on ESPN and CBS and NBC, if you hang around and watch the ticker, you can be there for a while before you get to check the second column on your chart. So I don't have the data for TSN or Score or Sportsnet, but I would be interested if you would all start watching the ticker for me. I'm going blind myself. So, and just see how long you have to follow that ticker before women show up. You might get lucky, but it's possible you're going to be staring at that for a very long time. And what's the message then for girls and women about their part in sport and physical activity? And how in the world are we ever going to counter this kind of atmosphere in which our girls and women live? How can they see themselves as part of this? And how can it be part of them? So it's a tough road to hoe, but it's a piece of the gap. And we need to tackle it directly as the piece that it is. It might encourage us to know that we have done some great things. I'll just let you read that for a second and then I'll tell you about it. But you know, our coverage of amateur sport and of the Olympic Games has improved so incredibly for women. Not by accident, but by design. And Karen, I think that was cause again, was it not? Led the media training and media packages and media education around how to write and talk about women in sport, although I did just read that the World Curling Championship was won by the slender Miriam Ott. You know, I thought there are better adjectives to describe an athlete, you know, the best in the world, but that's just me. You know, it could have been, I guess, the blue-eyed, fresh-faced, but we have so improved that part of the media, but not the that mainstream popular sports center ticker tape sort of thing. It wasn't always like this. This is the great Bobby Rosenfeld, who was Canada's athlete of the half century, was one of the matchless six, and a track Olympian, a terrific hockey player, described as the greatest hockey player of her time. And she, like many of her fellow athletes, women athletes in her day, became a sports writer. And this is actually something that Bobby wrote in the 30s in the Globe and Mail. You know, and we would be proud to see that in a newspaper today written by one of our athletes. So she's saying we're not satisfied anymore with being a rib of Adam. We've elected to hurl the discus, throw the javelin, run and jump as Adam does. So we have seen this in many Canadian newspapers, and it's pretty interesting to look at. So, you know, that's my quick trip through Canadian women's sport history. I have a little more to tell you, but it's a fabulous history, and there's some good publications out, and it's fun to read. And I would encourage you, if you're working with girls in sport, that we start to tell them a bit of this history and what some of these women athletes have done. When I ask my students, I do this regularly, you know, and had for a number of years. They come in and sit down, and we're going to talk about physical activity in sport. And I say, just take out a pen. They're hard to come by these days, pens, but sometimes they have to do it on their phone. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Say, just write down the names of 10 athletes. And, you know, when we share our lists then, Wayne Gretzky always makes it. Now, these kids weren't born when he played, were they? I mean, they weren't born. They didn't see him play. But he's always there on their list. How does that happen? The one woman who makes the list is Hayley Whitman. Thank goodness. I keep pulling for Christine Sinclair, but so far she's not showing up with any regularity. But, you know, whether they're men or women, 18, 19-year-olds in my class, when I say athlete, they write them down. Wayne Gretzky and all his buddies. Okay? So the influence of the media, I think, is tremendous. But they were part of the golden age, and what happened really was that the Second World War intervened. And you know what women did in the Second World War, of course, is the women manned the factories and all of the other work that needed to be done at home. They also, of course, provided the entertainment and sports. So we have the famous Edmonton Brads, as famous a basketball team as there has ever been in Canada, played out of Edmonton for 20-something years. The Preston Rivulets, a famous hockey team. And no doubt you've probably all seen A League of Our Own, professional baseball. And we had over 100 Canadian girls, mostly from the prairies, but some from here, go and play professional baseball. And during the war years, all these things thrive. And the pictures of the crowds at those games are tremendous, and many of them were broadcast. The Edmonton Brads were broadcast on the radio every time we played for years. But the war ended, and the men came home, and you know what happened to Rosie Riveter, right? She went home to be Rosie the dishwasher, and the same thing happened to the women's sport leagues. They went home too. And in the 50s, we entered the Leave It to Beaver phase of life, where, you know, the ideal, we thought that everybody lived in a family with a mom and a dad and 4 kids in those days, you know, we're shrinking. And Mom stayed home and looked after them, and Dad went to work, and when Dad came home, he was king, and Mom served up a feast, all dressed in a gown and makeup on and so on. You know, you've seen the movie, eh? So, sport, that was when it faded. So we had it, we lost it, it faded. And now, the effort has been ever since then, well, it didn't start then, of course, but ever since the 70s, to get it back. So our ideas about, you know, these are givens, this is natural, this is normal, are really, in terms of the history of our country, relatively recent ideas, and we can trace them exactly to this era. So we end up then with stories like this. And this is my friend Abby Hoffman, pictured as an Olympian from her Canadian Sports Hall of Fame photo, but from her first newscast, when she was discovered to be a girl. Which is only ever a problem, and it was only ever a problem when they were good athletes. I mean, she'd been hopeless, nobody ever would have known. You didn't have to show your birth certificate to play what would now be called house league in those days, but darned if she didn't get selected to this all-star team. They had to produce her birth certificate, and, you know, the gig was up. But, I mean, Abby was 9, she just wanted to play hockey. And so these are the stories that emerged then over the next 10 and 15 years of girls actually not being allowed to play. So when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women tabled its report in the House of Commons in 1970, there's one little line in there about sport and recreation, if you want to go back and dig it out, it's work. And it took us a long time to sign on. And we may not have completely signed on yet. Maybe we don't quite see it, and maybe we don't quite believe it, or maybe society just really doesn't see sport and recreation as areas that are equally important for both sexes to access. So as glorious as it is to be a female gold medal winner on the international stage, and I think it is glorious, and I know you do too, we see shades of the 1950s when we look to grassroots sport. It's not anymore, as it was in Abby's day, that no girls allowed. But you know and I know that if we call for registration for 5-year-old hockey, that more boys than girls will show up. And we know that if we set up a board for our organization, we're going to have more men than women. If we advertise a coaching job, we're going to have more men than women apply, even when the coaching is about coaching women. So the gap remains. One reason this matters to me very much is because I know, because I'm old and experienced now, that although we all claim, we tell our kids and our students, you can be anything you want to be, you just have to work hard and so on. I know this to be untrue. And what is in fact true, that you can be whatever you see yourself being. That's what's true. And so only when it surrounds you and becomes normalized does it become completely possible. So here's a test you can use for that. What's the face you see when you hear words like athlete, president, chair of the board, coach, leader? What's our assumption? Anna's scorer's assumption, coach, male. I suspect this is true for the majority of people. And so when we say to little girls, you can be anything you want to be, you know, they're smart little cookies. They have those same assumptions. Can they be a coach? Can they be an athlete? Can they be a leader? Can they be an administrator? Can they be the president? Can they be the prime minister? You can say it, but if there's no seeing it, there's no being it. So this is a key reason that it's so important to me that we make these changes, and I know how deliberate we have to be to make them. I know as well that you all have reasons why these things are important to you. I want to tell you a story. It's not an original story. I heard it first from the Women's Sport Foundation, which is the one in the United States. We have women's sports foundations in several countries, and there are organizations like Our Cause in Canada. So this is a pretty wonderful family, as you can see. It's a family of 3. Life is good, and their life is well planned. And when the parents started out, when they became a couple, they looked at student loans, of course, which now, fortunately, that we don't get old age security till we're 67, we'll have time to pay off before we retire. They looked at their student loans, and they looked at the cost of the house they wanted, and they talked about their desire to travel the world with their family during vacation times and others. And they knew what they wanted for their offspring and what it cost to provide it. And so they decided, indeed, that they would be a family of 3, that they were going to have 1 child, and they did. And this wonderful little guy you see in this picture had music lessons and dance lessons and swimming lessons and golf lessons. He went to a superb private school and a beautiful summer camp. And then the unforeseen happened. Miraculously, another child was found to be on the way. Well, what to do? So these wonderful parents thought, we've got to figure this out. We're going to have 2. Well, they thought perhaps one of us could get a second job, and with the extra income, we'd be able to maintain the lifestyle we've established for our family. But then they thought, well, yeah, but then we wouldn't be a family, and there are problems with that. But yeah, it's an option. And then they thought, this second baby hasn't even come along yet. This one doesn't know anything of the life of that one. We'll just have a different life for the second one. We got a lot of hand-me-down equipment in the basement. That summer camp really isn't completely necessary, and instead of providing lessons in all of these things, we'll pick a couple. They'll never notice because they've never experienced anything different. They said, that's an option. Hey, so now I go out and earn a whole lot extra bucks, or I just adjust the lifestyle of this second baby. Oh, they said, then, what's our third option? Well, you know what? Our third option is for us to sit down together and to discuss this in terms of what's fair now for each member of our family of 4. And how are we going to make this work? Will we all make a little adjustment so we'll all have a good, fair chance? Will we try and spend our time increasing revenue so we can have the same chance? Or will we just accept the fact that, lucky you, born first, here we go. So those are the options that we face about women and girls in sport. We can try and hugely increase revenues and buy girls everything that they need in order to participate in reasonable numbers. We can carry on as we are, which, it's a fairly peaceful place. I mean, they're not protesting in the streets, eh? Maybe everybody is used to these numbers in this gap. We can carry on doing the best we can, and maybe the mass of girls won't notice, just as they figured the second baby wouldn't. Or we can figure out what's fair and decide how we're going to get it. And here we are, and that's what I'm trying to do. Figure out what's fair and how we're going to get it. So it's not easy, you know. And as I said, that's where my scars come from. The committee, whether wise or not, has asked me specifically to share a little bit about my work in university sport. And so I'm going to do that. And I realized in trying to think about what I would say about this that I've never actually told this story. Although I've celebrated many, many times the successful outcome in the end, not 100% done by any means, but darn close, I've never actually spoken about the scars from the trenches. But I'm taking the committee's wisdom to say that I hope there is something that we can share and know from this kind of story. I hope there's something instructive in it anyway. Originally in university sport we called the men's part the CIAU. We changed to CIS around 10 or 11 years ago. But this is actually the 50th anniversary of the CIS, formerly the CIAU. But back in the beginning of time, when Peg and I were young, there were two organizations. There was the CIAU, the men's organization, and the CWIAU, the women's organization. And back in the 70s, the CW ran the women's championships, and the CI ran the men's championships. But you know, we had the Status of Women report. We came to a time in our country where we thought we should have one of everything, and one organization would serve everybody fairly. And so the CIU and the CWIAU married, didn't they? Peg was the bride.
I was the bride.
Peg was the bride. I mean, there was a symbolic marriage ceremony at the meeting, and they married and became the CIAU. As an organization responsible for men and women. Now, I wasn't there for that particular wedding of Peg's. I came a little bit later, around 80 or 81, as a delegate from the University of Alberta, the second where I worked at the time. And so I came around 80 or 81, and holy dime, women were a rarity in that room by then. I think the first meeting I attended, in counting, I believe the number, and as I said, my memory's fading. I believe there were 18 women and 78 men. This sticks in my head. I don't know how from. But that's from two organizations who were balanced, so to speak, and suddenly came together. And the women had disappeared because they were redundant now. I mean, the men were going to run it all, and there you go. So that was my first exposure, and I don't think that other than being intellectually curious, I really got anything or had any wise ideas at that time. Here's, I think, a key thing. Around that time, Abby, who you saw in the photo as an Olympic athlete, and I told you about as a 9-year-old, had become the director of Sport Canada around 1980, I believe, and there was a women's program established in Sport Canada, which is the federal government's sport funder, really. So the women's program, it was just one woman in there, but it was the fitness and amateur sport women's program at the time. And they decided that what they would do was ask sport organizations to form women's committee, and they would send out this women's program woman to work with the committees to teach them about planning and to make a plan. And so I got on that women's committee. It wasn't much of an accomplishment. I mean, there were hardly any women in the room, right? But anyway, there I was, and this young woman from Sport Canada came in, and we talked for 2 days, and son of a gun if we didn't figure out that, you know, this isn't the way it should look. Our universities don't look like this. And our programs and boards shouldn't look like this. We should, so we knew what we wanted to create. That was around 81, I think. And that was the beginning. And of course, I've always had this big mouth, you see, which is how I get in this troubling spot all the time. But, so I became the spokesperson for that committee. That meant that when we went into the meeting, which was still the 70-odd men and a few women, to present our motions to the general meeting, that I got to speak. Now, this is what it was like for 6 years, and I was a young chick, eh? And you know, it's hard. It's tough. So when the women's committee part of the agenda came along, everybody went to the bathroom. Or they went for a smoke break. Or they just talked about other things that were important. And that's exactly true. That's just what it was like. We could hardly get order in the room. And we never, for 6 years, for 5 years, not one of our motions passed. And each of those 5 years, we tried to make them less innocuous, you know. But anyway, in the 6th year, we did get a motion passed. And the motion was this. It was 1986. It's burned on my brain. That the CIU hold a women's soccer championship, provided it be at no cost to the organization. What do you think? That took me 6 years. So, and you know, the first Women's University Soccer Championship actually happened in 1987. But that was the best we could get from that organization at that time, was that they would allow us to hold this thing, but they wouldn't pay for it. We didn't get people to pay for it, and we held it. And it was a great success, and off we went. But I think what's instructive in that early story is that it was just a tough thing to do. And I can still, you know, I feel a little bit, it's sort of like having a caffeine buzz, you know, if you've experienced that. To stand up and speak in that kind of forum about an issue that nobody really wants to hear about, you know, that didn't really matter. They wanted to get on to important things, like what were going to be the rules around choosing the first team All-Canadian football squad, you see. And these things are important, of course, and what we were saying wasn't. And it's very hard, very threatening, and, you know, as I say, I can still generate in my body that physical feeling of apprehension. And I bet you can too. I know you can. I see any number of you who can. And it's important that we know that. Because when we see organizations with one woman sitting there, you know what's going on, hey? You know what's happening to her? You know what kind of responsibility she's feeling to make a change that you can't make alone in there? That's why we've got to band together and figure it out and make it work for all of us. So the life progressed in the organization, and in 1990 I happened to be in the room again when really we were having a very difficult meeting talking about a lot of trivia, and everybody was yelling and we couldn't get anywhere. And the end result of that complete turmoil in university sport was that the organization established what they called a Futures Committee. And the Futures Committee was to look at the organization and its governance and how university sport worked. And of course, by this time, we'd been a women's committee for a long time, and we at least got to the place where women had to be given some kind of ear. So we ended up with a committee of 5 that was named the Futures Committee, and it went to work. And there were 2 women on that Futures Committee. I was one of them, and 3 men. The 3 men were all named Bob, and the 2 women were feminists, and so I always say we had this, you're going to get this committee, 2 feminists and 3 Bobs, and here's how you go. So we worked for a long time. I don't know how much money we spent on that, but we would go to Montreal and have lunch and get fed up with each other and go home. And we met a lot for a long time to try and work out what to do. But here's what's hard, and here are my best hints for making change. You've got to build your group, and at least you've got to have a friend. You've got to have a hand to hold when you stand up and do these things. Nobody can do this alone. It's got to be somebody who's going to support you. So when you get a group, you've got to work out everything with that group, and that's why my friend and I and our Bobs, who I love to this day, and I'm still in touch with, they're wonderful guys, we argued and discussed and debated and read and thought and worked, and eventually we emerged a common block, determined to change this organization. The other part of that is when you're making change, you can never afford to make an enemy. And so I came to look at sport and recreation and these organizations this way. I respect everybody in the field. We're doing great work. We do very important work. Every one of us contributes to that work. I want you to give me the same respect and respect my contribution too. And I want us to get to a place where we can share our agenda and come to a common agenda. So that's, I think, how you need to work to make change in our world. We've got to convince people one at a time, and we've got to do it by being respectful of what they're saying and having them be respectful of us. Now, these are the stories I've never told before. It damn near killed me, right? Because, of course, you have to be that kind of person. So when I was in the room, me and my committee were in the room with these 75 or 80 people, we would split them up and spend time with our assigned people and talk to them about the issues and so on. Of course, sports people are great social organizers. So we'd meet all day, and then we'd have parties all night. Boy, we never missed a minute. The day that we passed the most important motion of all of this, and I was still at Mouthpiece, so it still had to work, The day that we passed the most important motion of this, Rachel, I never told you this, honey, you'd be astonished at your mother. But the party went on until 4 a.m. And I mean, we're not sitting there drinking coffee, Carolyn. We were on at 8:30 in the morning. And of course, at 4 a.m., we get together to see where we think we are and what chance we've got and how far we can push this. Then we go sleep for an hour. I got up, got in the shower, and I fainted. I smacked my head on the bathtub. So now here I am, tired, hungover, black eye, and there I am. To do it. It's tough. It's tough. But you know what? That day, that organization passed a motion about gender equity on its board. And it's reaped many, many rewards of that. We know that in order to make a real difference in terms of the agenda and the way of working, that we need 40% women. That's the benchmark. Right? That's why if you're the only woman on the board, or you're 20% of your board, you're having a tough time. That's why. It's not you. You're having a tough time. So we legislated, in fact, that we would have 40%. We couldn't figure out how to do it. Imagine the state we were in, we couldn't figure out anything. But the guy who was the Dean of Law at the University of Manitoba at the time figured it out for me. You got to have friends all over the universe and know who to call. So I called them and I said, here's the dilemma. You know, we elect our 4 executive members, and then we have 6 appointed regional reps. And there's the board, and we want to make sure it's gender equitable. How are we going to do it? Well, son of a gun, he figured it out. He said, all right. Now, he didn't know right away. He had to call me back. He said, you elect your 4 executive, your president, 3 vice presidents, I think is what we used to elect. And then you look at them, and if you got 4 men, then you need to get yourself 4 women. So you ask each of those regional associations to nominate a man and a woman. And those 4 executives will sit down, and the rules are 4 of their picks got to be women. And that's what we did. That's what they still do. Works like a charm. The conversation has changed. The organization has changed. There's, the opportunities are equitable. There's rules around money and expenditures and all kinds of things. And that whole organization now can sit down and have men and women in the room together, because it's also an organization where every university has 2 votes. You want them both, you send a man and a woman. You only want one of them, send 2 men or 2 women. And they sit down, and when they talk about gender equity issues, everybody in that room knows what they're talking about. They know where they're going. They want to get there, and they've had some great actions and great ways to work. So it can be done. It's being done. And we have examples all over the place. There's lots more to do with university sport. I'm not implying that. But I want you to know this can be done. And we can make it happen. And you don't have to party like I did to make it happen. Although if you're a social butterfly, there's certainly a lot to be said for it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I see that I just have 5 minutes. Do I, Heather? I've got Rhonda's watch here. It's sort of small, but I can see it. Okay, so that's just one story, and I know you all have stories, and we all have things we want to change, and that's why we're having workshops today, because we've got a lot of people here who know how to make change in those areas, and I know all of you know something about that. Together we can work it out, and we can figure out how we're going to hold each other's hands while we go at it. There's lots more. This is from the CIS annual report, I think around the mid-2000s. So yeah, the board of directors and all the committees, no less than 40%. And gender equity is just a screening tool now for everyone. So I've told you some of the things that I know about making change. And there's no doubt that one of the key things is, did I just turn myself off? One of the key things is courage. It's not easy to be the voice and to be the upfront person and to put things on the agenda that are not the popular agenda. What did I do? I want to use it. So it's broken now. Courage we need to have, and I think we find that in numbers. That's where courage comes from somebody else who supports us in our thinking. But there are 2 other things, I think, that are key to whether or not we're really going to be successful in this change. And I've got them up on this slide. Most of the changes that I've been part of in sport have been pushed by a funder. So I told you that in the early days, Sport Canada put a few bucks into a women's program, and they sent out this one consultant to train the rest of us on how to do it. And that was the beginning, all these women's committees being creative. We didn't get, we got fairly far, I guess, for the day with women's committees, but it's not where we are now, now we're all in this together, and we're going to do it as organizations. But the push came from one of the funders of the organization. The more important push came later, I think, when Sport Canada, the federal government funder to national sport organizations, said, here's what you need to show us before we're going to consider your funding application. You need to show us a plan to increase the number of women engaged in sport. So, and that's where it started. You need to show us a plan. Right? And then you can have your money. A little while later, we push it a little further. You need to show us some improvement in those numbers, and then you can have your money. A little while later, you need to show us your organization has a policy on harassment, and then you can have your money. You see how it works. So, you know, these aren't big pushes on organizations, but they're important pushes, because you got my money. And when I say to the organization, you need to make a plan to increase the number of women in your organization, the number of young girls participating in your sport, your after-school activity, or whatever you've got, and you make that plan, you're going to spend the time talking about the things we're talking about today, and you're going to find all kinds of resources to help you make that plan. And you're going to get people excited about doing it, and you're going to do it. So this is one of the things I know. Right? This will make it possible in our lifetime. Without that, it probably is going to take 2 or 3 more lifetimes. The second thing I know is that we've got to have the backroom information. And we've got to have a way to collaborate on the things that are of common importance to us. When we think about the way sport is presented to our young girls and boys, we looked at the television data. I told you about my kids naming athletes that hardly ever included women, but knowing about men who performed before they were born. When we think of countering all that, oh wow. We've got to have an organization, a group, something back here that works like these organizations do. We need to celebrate women and girls. We need to celebrate their accomplishments. And we need to do it loudly. And let Nova Scotia girls and women see it. And if we each try and do that in our own little piece, that's where it stays, a little piece. If we can come together and have an umbrella group somehow, then they can help us do these things. We can have provincial awards to celebrate what girls and women accomplish in sport. When I want, I'm desperate for it. The University of Manitoba is looking for a soccer coach for their women's team. They're desperate for a woman. I have any number of phone calls about it. For God's sake, where am I going to find them one? Okay? And how is this call coming to me? I'm 65 years old and I never played soccer in my life. You know, come on. When your organization wants to bring women into coaching, do you have to invent the wheel yourself? Or is it all there for you? Who can help us? That's what we need in some central place so that you can access it and we can all contribute to it and make it happen. We've got a terrific resource in CAUSE, and I hope you all get a chance to talk to Karen and look at caaws.ca in the near future and see all the things that are available for us. And this is an Alberta group, the In Motion Network, and this logo here is the BC group, Promotion Plus, and they're doing terrific work too. And you should look at the work they're doing in their province and how their organizations work and what's available there. These are the 2 things that I think would be an absolutely huge help to us and allow us to make these changes, to close that gap within a reasonable time frame. And when we close that gap, as I said, in the title. We're all gonna mind the rewards. That's, I think, we're all finished.